When you think about skiing through the forest, and I have actually skied before on the greens, but I've done it before, or sliding down the slopes, trees are always a part of that imagery. We see some beautiful trees out here in Lake Placid. I saw some this morning on my way in, just incredible. But they play a much larger role in protecting winter than simply making the landscapes look beautiful, and they surely do that. In fact, we're doing all we can during these World University Games here in Lake Placid to promote reforestation. Okay, and we're doing that by promoting our One Tree Planted project to address athlete travel to the games. Talking a little bit about that carbon footprint. So we hope that all of you who are here and those who may be watching, maybe there's a big way to do it online, scan the code that's found in the lobby, and you'll find it around the games as well. There's a code you can scan to support the goal of planting 26,500 trees. Is that not a great goal or what? Absolutely. All right, so let's do this before we bring the panel up. Let's check out another short film from Northeast Wilderness Trust before we meet the panelists. Here it is.
There really just hasn't been a more urgent moment in human history to conserve as much land as possible, both sustainable forestry and wilderness. There has been an incredible amount of science that's come out in the last few years that point to the unparalleled value of wild forests to conserve biodiversity, to hold off extinction, and to store and sequester incredible amounts of carbon. We know that wilderness is an incredibly powerful natural climate solution, and we need to be conserving more of it. Northeast Wilderness Trust is a land trust based in Montpelier, Vermont. We work all across New England and the state of New York. And we were founded in 2002 and have conserved 37,000 acres of land up to this point. All of the properties that Northeast Wilderness Trust protect are considered forever wild, which means from the moment we either acquire it or put an easement on it, there will no longer be logging, and the property will essentially be an old-growth forest of tomorrow.
We have to adjust our heads to move in forest time. I'm deeply envious of the people in 300 years who get to see the forests we protected today when they're all grown up. Because, I mean, on the time scale of a tree, most of the forests in northern New England are like teenagers and barely get beyond that. When there is some potential future time down there where our properties have 300-year-old trees on it, that's going to be really cool. We are at the Bramhall Wilderness Preserve in Bridgewater Hollow, Vermont. We conserved this property in March of 2020. And so when I first came here and I met this property, I just had this really magical experience. I was walking through the woods and there was just a porcupine on a rock looking at me, and there were deer and there was moose rubs everywhere, and it was early spring, so there were all kinds of little amphibians in the vernal pools, and it was just super magical. And I think maybe I'm slightly biased, but that magic has just sort of permeated every visit since then. And it sort of grew as a place that became really important to me, and it became really important to me to finish this project. So some of the features of this place that make it important for wildlife are, one, there's a really mature forest. There's a long history of human Westerners settling here and kind of clear cutting, taking down all the forests. And so almost everything we have here is second growth forest in the whole Northeast. Those forests have been used in a wide variety of ways ever since, for timber, for sugaring, for firewood extraction, stuff like that. And so as a result, sort of across the region, our forests are really lacking in that old forest structure, those big dead trees, those big down logs. And those are important for tons of things. Those are important for little tiny decomposers and slime molds, but they're also important for bears, which will hibernate in them for the winter, and coyotes will have their pups in them, and fishers will live in them and hunt in them. And so all the way from the large mammals to the tiny mammals to the slimy little organisms, that kind of structure is really important. And it's rare. It's really rare. And this place has a lot of it. And as a result, we really wanted to protect this as it is.
Babysitter Swamp has always impressed me as being unique, practically from the first time I saw it over 45 years ago, because it's the only place along this wetland complex that has old trees. And as a wildlife ecologist, I began to recognize that there were things going on that property that were different than the other properties. It's the upper tooth that inserts into and stops and anchors, and then it's the drag of the lower jaw that actually makes the bite.
Wow.
Isn't that cool? Here, you come feel this. Babysitter Swamp is a name that I gave this property because when I first started coming here, my research quickly helped me appreciate that it was being used by mother bears and their infants. Basically what happens is the mothers bring their little ones to these huge old trees, and the cubs climb the trees to get out of harm's way while she feeds in the adjoining wetland. And there's a green up, as we call it, of sedges and forbs that happen there in late April and May when she's using this place that are really important food for her. What seems odd is that this place gets used every year, and yet bears only have offspring every other year. So what's going on? A given mother bear will use the trees every other year, but it's her daughters that use the trees in the alternate years. And that's what my research revealed. And as a tracker and professional naturalist, I know that the trees are getting used every year because of the scent marking sign that I find. The hairs on the trees, the claw marks, the bites. From the beginning, I wanted to conserve my property with Northeast Wilderness Trust. It was both incredibly wonderful and logical that I do that. There isn't a day that goes by that I'm not just immensely grateful for that opportunity, because here in the East, where so much of our land is privately owned, we're really lucky to have this organization helping us do this important work.
So something can feel wild or have a wild character, but unless it's protected, there's no guarantee it will stay that way.
I've seen too many wonderful places get trashed. I've spent a lot of time in some of the wildest habitat in North America. And the thing that causes me great pain is the realization that again and again, no matter where I am, from the Ungava Peninsula in northern Quebec all the way across to the Arctic National Refuge, with 11 different caribou herds, for example, that I've studied, none of it's safe. Very little of it is put aside as wilderness. I think each and every one of us really needs to get on this and work with organizations like Northeast Wilderness Trust to put these wonderful lands aside forever. And large and small alike. I don't care if you want to conserve 20 acres or 200 acres or 2,000 acres. It's all important.
The biggest threat to wilderness is not what's actually happening to wilderness that exists, but it's the lack of wilderness areas in New England. Out of all of the incredible conservation that's happened across the region, which at this point is upwards of 25% of New England, has been conserved in some way. Only about 1 to 3% of all of that is forever wild. It's a radical act of humility to put a piece of land into a designation that means humans permanently will not do anything with it. Western civilization has dictated that forests are there for our benefit. Our civilization has been built on the backbone of these forest resources. Wilderness conservation flips that entire thing on its head. And it's about setting these places aside permanently for their benefit, not for ours.
Beautiful. Okay, so let's learn more from Chris Dickerson about his work with One Tree Planet and invite him up to the stage. Come on up. Also joining Chris, welcome back. Also joining Chris today is Sophie Veltrup. She is the outreach manager for the Northeast Wilderness Trust, founded back in 2002. And their mission is to conserve forever wild landscapes for nature and people. Come on up, thank you. There she is. Good morning. And our third panelist representing the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation is Molly Hassett. Come on up, Molly. Good morning. Molly is a forester in the Bureau of Forest Management's Carbon Forestry and Climate section in the Department of Environmental Conservation. So, have at it. We look forward to the conversation.
Hello?
Hello. Okay. Thanks, guys. So good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Molly Hassett from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. I guess before we really dive into the conversation more here, we're each going to have our turn and kind of give an overview of what we work on and some of the things that are important as far as forests. So I'd like to start my talk today about just kind of giving a quick overview of why forests are important and talking about how forests contribute to climate mitigation. So forests take carbon dioxide directly from the atmosphere during photosynthesis. Once inside the tree, that carbon dioxide is converted to sugar and the carbon moves throughout the rest of the tree. It can be stored inside the leaves, inside the roots, inside the stem of the tree, and as that tree starts to decay, or if there's a wildfire, it moves throughout the ecosystem to other parts of the ecosystem. Or it can actually be emitted as well. So when you look at a log in a forest, or if you look around wood paneling on the walls and the wood furniture we're sitting on here, about 50% of wood, of dry wood anyway, is carbon, which is just really awesome because those trees are doing their work. They're taking that carbon and they're storing it. And if you look inside an ecosystem, a forest ecosystem, most of that carbon is actually stored inside the soil. So in New York, about 55% of the carbon that's taken in from the atmosphere eventually gets stored as soil, and about 30% is stored inside the branches, the leaves, the twigs, and the stem of the tree. So that's kind of how carbon, I guess, looks inside a forest. So thinking about carbon emissions from forests, again, I already kind of said when the tree starts to decay, or maybe some soil respiration takes place, the tree gets eaten, or a wildfire occurs, that carbon can move to other parts of the ecosystem, or it can actually be released back into the atmosphere. So in other parts of the United States, like out in California, where they've had like really severe wildfires in the past several years, the forests can actually emit more carbon into the atmosphere than they're taking in each year. But in New York, at least right now, we're pretty lucky that the forests are continuing to sequester that carbon. They're taking in that carbon and they continue to store it more than they're emitting carbon, which is really great for climate mitigation. So one thing you guys might be wondering right now is, why is there the focus on forests? Why not other ecosystems? And forests, because of trees, they sequester the most carbon dioxide out of all other land use types. And in New York, forests sequester about 4 times the amount of carbon dioxide that wetlands do, and about 16 times the amount of carbon dioxide than grasslands do. So they're working really hard out there. Forests also, once that carbon dioxide has been taken in, they store more carbon than most other ecosystems. The exception here is wetlands. Wetlands actually do store about 25% more carbon in New York than forests do, just because they keep it really well inside their soils. But forests, as the second highest carbon per acre for storage, they store about 3 times the amount of carbon than grasslands or croplands, and about 15 times the amount of carbon that's stored in developed areas. So once you convert a forest to a grassland or a cropland, or if you build, I don't know, a Walmart there, there's a huge loss of carbon back to the atmosphere. So also for New York anyway, the concentration on forests is also because we have so much of it. So in New York, we have 18.6 million acres of forests, which is about 61% of the land area. So that's pretty great. Of course, we can always do better. But because forests take in so much carbon, and because New York has so much forest, the forests really drive the stats for carbon sequestration. They really help mitigate climate change in New York. More than land use, more than other areas, they're really important for climate change. I also wanted to say that, similar to the video you guys just watched about the Northeast, where they mentioned that a lot of the forests are in their teenage years, in New York we had a similar trend where in the late 1800s, a lot of the forests had been cut down and converted to other land use, a lot of agriculture really, and they only started growing back in the late 1800s. And at that time, only about 20% of New York was forested, so we're back to 61%. But those younger forests, especially much younger forests, do sequester carbon at a higher rate. So I think it's important to think about balancing both like the old growth forests, which we definitely need for carbon storage, as well as some young growth forests, some young forests across the landscape, which is also important for wildlife habitat, just having a really diversity of different ecosystems. So, kind of jumping to a different track, but along the same line, New York State passed the Climate Act in 2019, which has mandated several clean energy targets, including 70% renewable energy by 2030, 100% zero emissions from electricity generation by 2040, and an 85% reduction in greenhouse gases from 1990 levels by 2050. And in addition to this, there is a goal for net zero emissions by 2050, which that net zero emissions really is going to rely on forest carbon sequestration. And to meet that net zero emissions, New York's forests are going to have to just about double their current sequestration levels. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. To move towards these sequestration goals, the state's going to need to use strategies like conserving forests, as well as using some forest management, planting new trees, expanding the use of wood products, and sustainable forest management. But in addition to like those larger strategies, there's a lot of things that everyone can do. Some of the simple steps that folks can do is planting and growing trees wherever we can, and using and reusing wood products instead of other carbon-intensive products like concrete, steel, and plastic. Protecting soils by staying on trails and avoiding wet areas can really help keep the carbon in the soil. Limiting the spread of invasive species by using boot brushes before you go on a trail, as well as using local firewood instead of moving firewood from place to place, and trying to plant native species rather than different species from other areas of the state or country can also help. So if you're looking to make a difference, now is a great time to start. As time goes on, the climate change impacts are just going to get worse and worse, and we all know that. But for forests, we're also going to see that. We expect that carbon sequestration in forests might start to decline as climate change impacts get worse and worse, with movement and higher success rate of invasive species, as well as more frequent droughts and storm events. And we also expect to see kind of lower planting and establishment success rate for young trees. So things are going to get harder and harder, but I think if we all start now, we can all make a difference that'll matter. And that's my talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Molly.
Does anyone have any quick questions on any of that before we move over to Sophie? All right, pass it over to you for now.
Thank you so much. I'm going to, I'm just going to reintroduce myself because I'm not sure if the connection with the video was quite clear. I work for Northeast Wilderness Trust, which is the organization that you just saw in the video. And I'm going to jump off from Molly talking about carbon science. I'm not going to waste any time convincing anybody about how bad climate change is. We're all on the same page with that. It was really cool to hear the change you've seen in the past 10 years of just how much people are, how that mood is changing in different places. So let's get to the solutions, and let's get to the, what are we doing now? So Molly talked about carbon science in forests, and I'll start there, and then we'll move a little bit into biodiversity and habitat over time. So Northeast Wilderness Trust specializes in the wilderness niche of things. So we've got the broad picture of land conservation, which includes managed landscapes, managed forests, farms, urban parks, forests, planting trees, all of that. And then the part that we work on is the wilderness preservation side of things. So these are lands that are much more hands-off. Some people call it passively managed. And I'll get a little bit more into the philosophy of that too. So the benefit of old forests is that they store a huge amount of carbon. So that's the physical, literal carbon in the systems. So they're places that we really want to keep them storing that carbon. We don't want to cut them and convert them to young forests because that releases a huge amount of carbon, not only from the harvest process, but also the storage. So that's sort of the old carbon is, you can think of it as the bank. It's holding the money. And then the sequestration is kind of the, if we're going with the money analogy, the rate of what's going into that bank, right? The income. And so different forests and ecosystems have different sequestration rates. Old forests, that rate starts to slow down. But what's really cool is that not that long ago, maybe a couple decades ago, it was believed that old forests, once they get to about 120 years, which is around the place where they're considered old growth, it was believed that they either stop sequestering carbon or that they start to emit carbon. And so that's not good. However, within the past couple decades, science has shown us that old forests continue to sequester carbon. They continue to act as that sponge, gaining more over time, even past that 100, 150-year mark. So that's, it's a cool time because the scientific arguments to support wilderness have never been stronger before. And so in the video that you just saw, we connected with some of the older forests that Northeast Wilderness Trust has protected. And since this video was made, I think John mentioned in there that 37,000 acres have been protected by Northeast Wilderness Trust. And we're the regional land trust that does sort of private rather than the public, state, federal wilderness conservation, working across New England and New York. So in the time since that video was made, which was about 2 years ago, we're now at 73,000 acres protected, so that's about double what it was before. And all of that acceleration is exactly this. This is why there's like all of this stuff that we're all doing, that you all are a part of, is what we need to be doing now, and the time has never been more urgent. So in addition to those old forests that you saw, Northeast Wilderness Trust is also protecting younger forests. So these ones you saw were harvested maybe 80 years ago, but we're also protecting forests that were harvested 50, 30, even 10 years ago. So they're starting from that, maybe even before teenagehood, like toddlerhood in forest time, and they're being allowed to grow to that old age. It'll take decades, but that whole time they're doing their important jobs of putting carbon out of the atmosphere into the bodies of trees, into the soil, and all that great stuff that not only benefits our climate goals and carbon storage, but also benefits the structure of the forest, the animals who live there, and all of that. One sec, I'm gonna take a drink. So another focus that we haven't really come to yet is the habitat side of things. And as we think about the climate changing, it's impacting us so directly. We're all feeling it, not only through our sports. Going out on the trails completely. I really appreciated that that anecdote you shared of just how physical the reality is for people who love nature, who are outside, whether that's through sport or science, etc. And the animals and plants out there are feeling it with us. So as the climate changes, not only is it going to impact us, as you all know, animals, plants, they're all going to have to move around and find new places where the conditions they've adapted to for millions of years, thousands of years, can be something they can survive within. So in terms of land conservation, we not only have to protect a lot of land, but we have to do it strategically so that that land is connected to each other and so that it's as diverse as possible. And that will allow animals, as they're adapting to these very different conditions, to move both higher in elevation, to find different niche habitats as the moisture and temperature changes, and to move northwards. And this is really the best way that we as humans can support our wild relatives in their resilience in these this upcoming climate chaos, is to protect as much land as we can, as quickly as we can. And I'll just finish with a little bit more about the philosophy of wilderness and an invitation. We talk about so many of the human benefits, and those are all so important. The water quality, clean air, carbon storage, being able to go out to places to connect with wild nature and feel more at peace. The research on the mental health benefits of being outside has just skyrocketed in the past decade. The reasons are just innumerable. And at the heart of that is also this sort of shift in perspective and turning towards the land in a new way. For so many years in this country since colonization, the land has been regarded as a thing, as an object, as a resource. And absolutely, we rely on those resources, and we need to do that to a certain extent. But there's been such a lack of, at a like grand mainstream cultural level, of regarding the land as a relationship, as a community of living, animate, intelligent beings who we are connected to as people. And I think that's really like the core of wilderness that doesn't get talked about as much, of turning towards the land as these creatures, this community that we as humans have evolved with since our beginning as a species on this planet. And that's what gets me really jazzed about this work. So my invitation is to find a land trust or an organization in your community, in your region, that's doing this kind of work. Get involved, whether that's learning more, attending events, volunteering. I loved the comment about citizen science. That's a really important way to get involved. Becoming a member. A lot of these land trusts and organizations rely on member support to keep them going. And to form your own relationship. I'm sure I'm not saying anything new to any of you, but to deepen that relationship with the forest, the wetlands, the waters that are near you.
It's awesome. So yeah, I love how it's perfectly in sequence to find out what you can do, and it ends with me. So interesting. I'll just give some background how I ended up with One Tree Planet, just from the sports side, is because when we first started, this particular initiative of getting more athletes involved in planting trees and understanding the balance that we have within urban communities, and like you said, is a lot of how that research is coming to light about how much, from a mental health space, is like the effect that having open green spaces has in urban communities, and just from the stress levels, and coincidentally how crime rates are lower in places that are heavily forested, that do have urban canopy. So as we started with 8 athletes, we had 24 athletes last year, but for me coming on board, it was just like, hey, why don't you just kind of come on board and work with us to build out this program and to have this partnership? And so big part of this, for me, it was a learning experience for me. It's been an upward learning curve on, what the importance of trees is, but just the complexity of trees. So, but in all this complexity, and I know you guys are out there, and you guys are, a lot of this stuff just from the actual side goes over your head, like carbon sequestration. It gets complex. So what we do at One Tree Planet is we make it as basic as possible. And that's what the coolest thing for me, being on the sports side, is like, you have to understand what your audience is. And I'm not saying we're all a bunch of dumb jocks, but we're just, it's just like, hey, $1 a treat, but it gives, fans and athletes the opportunity to address so many different things through the power of what we do at One Tree Planet, whether that's global reforestation projects or it's projects right in your own backyard. But then moving to this sports network, like we're going into urban communities and urban reforestation, having the urban forestry fund. So we're trying to address a lot of these, but making it fun and impactful to where it's easy for you to commit to these. So it's great having, like an Earth Day event with the Chicago Cubs, where we can, for every attendee, that comes to the game, plant $1 per tree. And it sounds really insignificant. And, with our last conversation, it's like, don't see it as just one tree and just a sapling being super insignificant, because if you think about just if everybody in here were just to commit to one tree, like, again, when I talked about what that looks like, we don't give enough credit to the visual perspective of what that looks like. And so that's why it was so important for me to get that across, because I think a lot of us get in this place where we just feel hopeless, like we can't really make a difference. But just everybody in this auditorium, like, we have the power, but to have those visuals created, that if we were to go outside and we were just to pick a space, a small corner, and we all planted a tree and then came back in 10 years, like, it would be a significant piece of land that we've all contributed to. And then you put this in, sports where you have the opportunity to get to 45, 50,000 people a night. And like, that's why that's important. So, just understanding their perspective there is like, if every 50,000 people, there's 50,000 seats. What does 50,000 trees look like? It's incredible, but that also all started with like $1 commitment. So, you're talking about like young forests as far as like, 5, 10 years, but even up to 5 years, it's still making a difference on how the forest operates within itself and how it's increasing the efficiency of what that ecosystem is supposed to be doing. So It's been, for me, just coming on board with the company. It's incredibly gratifying knowing that we have that power in such a small contribution, but you're making such a huge impact that lessens that climate anxiety that we all feel, that we're just like, what can I do? So I think that's great, but also just the different projects. And I think as an international event, one thing it's great is because there's so many different projects that we can personally relate to. So whether it's planning in France or forest fire restoration in Portugal after they went through, their massive fires, and be able to give back and contribute, providing fruit trees in Honduras and in India and all these different places around the world, and having these great descriptions on what exactly is giving back, why it's important. And so just these different dimensions of what we do at One Tree Planet has been incredible. And, I just urge you guys, don't feel like you can't make a difference. And I'm not sitting here like promoting One Tree Planet. I understand where we're at individually, and it's overwhelming. But having specialists on the stage explaining the value that's in that sapling and putting something into the ground, the value that has should give you hope into creating that connection to where, you don't have to feel like you're not doing anything by, what's a small sapling, a dollar tree, is like, that is going to be put to work. And it's a very valuable piece of where we're at and how it can, not just from doing mangroves and contributing to to sequestering carbon through the blue carbon and all these tremendous projects, but just don't be overwhelmed. You can make the smallest difference, and I'm not going to sit up here and be like dancing like a spokesperson. I'm just trying to get that across, that they're giving you the science, and us what we're trying to do as far as like having the opportunities to get out into the community and having these these civic opportunities to teach about the science and why it's important, and the smallest things that you can do that can give back, like planting wildflowers and being pollinators and all of this stuff that is so great for our urban environments, but just in the grand scheme of things, they're so insignificant that you might feel, but they're making a huge impact.
I can pick up with a little bit more on the hope side. And again, I'm not going to, overly do it. I feel that climate anxiety and grief every single day, as I'm sure you all do. Molly, in preparing for our talk, showed me this great graph of how much forest was here upon European arrival in the Northeast. And then around the 1800s, how that had plummeted to around, I believe, 20-30%. And right now we're about here. We've made incredible strides in the Northeast. This is the only temperate forest in the entire world that has gained in acreage. And so it is possible. We still have a long ways to go, but right here where you all are sitting, wherever you came from, the Adirondacks is one of those success stories. I mean, the forests and trees around us right here, if we had been here 100, 200 years ago, they wouldn't have been here. And I think that success story of the Adirondacks, the Northeast, going from almost a completely denuded landscape to a landscape that is so full of life, that's something that on the hard days of climate grief and anxiety, I go back to thinking about that and remembering that that's possible in other places, and there's more work to be done on that front here.
Absolutely, and to add to that, trees that are growing individually outside of a forest condition, they actually continue to gain in carbon sequestration as they grow older. So as they get older, they can take more and more and more carbon out of the atmosphere. So if you have a lawn that has a big open space in it and you plant a tree there, it's a great spot, and that tree is going to definitely make a difference. So even just little steps like that.
Open it up for questions.
Take a few questions.
Sure thing.
I feel like the acoustics, I just repeat the question. I feel like the acoustics, because.
We've got the people on who are watching on the VLA live stream who won't be able to hear it though.
Oh, that's
yeah.
right. Dang it.
Sure.
Thank you. So I just want to say thank you to all of the panelists for recognizing the value of reforestation, afforestation, but also the natural regeneration, rewilding of the landscapes in the Northeast. Aaron, doing your thing. And I feel like, New York State, through its recent climate scoping plan that it finalized in December 2022, said committing to 1.7 million acres of reforestation, afforestation by 2040, which is really aggressive and really great. I do think that there are larger concerns somewhat addressed in the plan, thinking about renewable energy siting, the migration of people to the Northeast because of the amount of resources that we have in clean air, clean water, and access to land. And so thinking critically about how are we going to support our forest ecosystems and the vast other types of ecosystems here in the Northeast and the Adirondacks alone. But now my question is, can you speak to the value of fungal networks and how fungi play a role in the carbon benefits, role in carbon sequestration and storage and communication of information? Because I feel like that's something that's recently coming to light for people, but I think we should continue to share that message, just how valuable those networks are below ground, the things that we can't see. Thank you.
Well, for sure, fungal networks are really important for forests, especially they're called mycorrhizal fungi. So they really help trees get started, they help trees grow faster, they help trees take in water more efficiently and do a way better job at it. And those networks also do have carbon stored because they are a creature. I haven't personally read into the fungal networks and how the carbon storage and dynamics occur because they are also respirating, so they are decaying a little bit and emitting to the soil. So I'm not sure if they're helping, I guess, sequester in the soil itself or if inside their own bodies or if they're emitting more. I don't have a good answer on that, but they are helping the trees grow, so they are vastly important.
I can think of a couple of resources on that as well. And there's a recent book called Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake. There's also one that Suzanne Simard put out. She was with her team of researchers, they discovered that trees share carbon and communicate with one another, not only between one species, but between different species, which not only is super cool, but kind of turns that that Darwinian narrative of only that life forms are only in competition with each other on its head, just further supporting that plants and fungi have this intelligence and work together. And another thing about like old forests and carbon storage and the mycorrhizal networks together is that these networks are very complex and they take a long time to build. And so when those networks, I think an example comes to mind of farming. When you till the soil, those hyphae are severed, and it takes a while for them to come back, and they are really important in getting that carbon into the soil. And so the same thing happens if the soil in an old forest is disturbed. Not only are we losing carbon, but we're really damaging the fungi and the relationships that exist underground, and that takes a while to come back. And there are ways to, you probably know a lot more about this than I do, but I know there are ways to harvest from forests that can lessen that impact and be much more sustainable. It's often sort of like the clear-cutting kind of forestry that is the worst for that kind of thing. So it's not an either-or by any means. And there are ways that we can think about our mushroom friends as well when we're taking what we need from the forests.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panel for a great discussion. Thank you all for the great questions. Good stuff, everyone? All right. Thank you all very much.